A quiet beginning. I once watched my grandmother lace up her boots before heading out on a cold November morning. She always wore those same brown leather boots, the kind with the stiff heel and brass hooks, and she always took her time, as if every knot meant something. I must have been 10, maybe 11. I asked her where she was going, and she said very softly, "I am going to vote." Then she added, like it was a secret, just for me. They did not always let us, you know. Back then, I did not understand what she meant, but I never forgot the way she said it, like it carried the weight of women I had never met, women whose names I would only read years later in books with faded covers and quiet pages. Elizabeth, Susan, Alice. They were not in the stories we were taught in school, not back then, but their voices were still there, if you knew how to listen. So, tonight let me tell you the story of those voices. The long, quiet fight that led to that soft November morning. It did not begin with a scream. It began with a whisper. Before the vote had a name, I once read in an old book, one of those thick ones, with the cloth spine and the pages that smell like dust and time, that in the early 1800s a woman in America could be arrested for speaking too boldly in public. Not for shouting, not for insulting anyone, just for speaking, just for being heard. And I remember setting the book down, pressing my hand to the paper, like I could touch the world it came from, because that world was not really so far away. Back then, a woman's world was drawn in borders of lace and linen. She could cook, she could clean, she could teach children, especially boys, to read and write, but she could not own property. If she married, she could not keep her own wages. If her husband died, the law often gave her children to his relatives. And of course, she could not vote. Not even for the school board. Not even for the man who decided what her taxes would pay for. You remember that time, do you not? Or maybe your mother told you stories. Women with calloused hands and quiet mouths. They ran homes like captains ran ships, but they were expected to step aside when the men spoke. They were supposed to be the angels of the house, which was just a soft way of saying they should disappear when the world got serious. But even then, before the word suffrage was printed on banners or stitched into sashes, there were murmurs. Gentle ones. A question here, a raised eyebrow there. Why can I not keep the money I earn from sewing? Why can I not testify in court when I saw what happened with my own eyes? Why can I not vote when I pay the same taxes? In the countryside, a few women kept diaries where they wrote about these things, but only for themselves. In cities, there were quiet conversations in sewing circles, or whispered words at church gatherings. Some brave souls published anonymous essays in local papers, signing only with initials. They did not shout yet. They could not. But they were listening to each other. And it was not just in America. Across the Atlantic in Britain, women were beginning to ask the same questions. They met in parlors over weak tea and strong opinions. The first societies for women's education and property rights began to form, often hidden under the polite veil of charity work. Because in those days, if you wanted to change the world, you had to make it look like you were just helping it tidy up. I remember reading about a woman, her name escapes me now, who was asked why she cared so much about politics. She smiled, folded her hands, and said, "Because politics has always cared about me whether I wanted it to or not." That line stayed with me, because it was true. Laws were made about women every day, and yet women had no voice in shaping them. The world kept insisting they were too delicate for politics, even as it made decisions that broke their backs. Now, not every man agreed with this silence. Some fathers taught their daughters to speak with clarity. Some brothers smuggled books to their sisters. Some husbands sat beside their wives and read aloud the news, pausing every so often to ask, "Well, what do you think?" And a few even listened to the answers. But for the most part, the silence stayed, and women learned to work within it. They organized reading clubs that slowly turned into debate circles. They joined abolitionist movements, realizing that the fight for freedom was something they too deserved. They marched for the end of slavery, and in doing so, began to understand the power and the cost of a public voice. You might remember that time. Or maybe you remember your grandmother telling you about it. How she wore her best gloves to meetings not out of vanity, but because people would judge the message by the hands that carried it. How she practiced speaking in front of a mirror just once, just to see if her voice could fill a room. And slowly things began to stir. Not loudly, not yet, but the questions grew sharper, more insistent. More women began to write under their real names. More men began to take notice, not always kindly, but at least with attention. And in one small town in New York, a group of women decided that a whisper was no longer enough. They wanted to speak, in public, together. But that is a story for tomorrow night. For now, let us stay in this quieter hour. The time when women still walked to the market with their heads down, but their thoughts were racing. When young girls looked at their mothers and wondered why no one asked them what they believed. When the idea of voting was not a right or a law, it was just a thought, a hope, a name not yet spoken aloud. Let us stay here a moment longer in the hush before the storm. Because before there were marches, there were murmurs. And before there were speeches, there were sighs. And somewhere in those sighs, a new world began to breathe. Seeds in Seneca Falls. There is a small town in upstate New York called Seneca Falls. You might have driven through it once on your way to somewhere else. Blink, and you could miss it. The kind of place with one main street, a bakery that smells like cinnamon, and church bells that ring a little off-key. But in the summer of 1848, it became the quiet beginning of something loud. I remember reading about it in a book left behind at a train station. Someone had underlined names in pencil: Stanton, Mott, McClintock. I did not know them then, not really. But those pencil marks felt like someone whispering, "These ones matter." Elizabeth Cady Stanton was one of them. A young mother at the time, full of words the world did not want to hear. She had grown up watching men speak at podiums, while women were told to keep their thoughts in the parlor. Her father was a judge, and she once overheard him tell a widow there was nothing the law could do for her. "I wish you were a boy," he told his daughter once. That kind of sentence settles deep. Then there was Lucretia Mott, a Quaker, soft-spoken, steady, with eyes that missed nothing. She had traveled to London years before for an anti-slavery convention, only to be told she could not speak because she was a woman. She sat in silence behind a curtain, listening to men debate the rights of other men, and she made herself a quiet promise: never again. These two women met. They talked. They planned. And then, with the help of a few other brave souls, they sent out a small notice in the local newspaper. It invited women and any sympathetic men to gather for a meeting on July 19th and 20th, 1848, at the Wesleyan Chapel in Seneca Falls. It was not a revolution. Not yet. It was a meeting. But the room filled faster than they expected. Some came out of curiosity, others out of anger, and a few, I suspect, out of hope they could finally say aloud the things they had only whispered. They called it a convention, though the word felt grander than the room itself. Wooden benches, open windows, dresses rustling in the July heat. Elizabeth read aloud a document she had written the night before at her kitchen table, between nursing her baby and brushing out her children's hair. They called it The Declaration of Sentiments. It began with familiar words. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal. A simple sentence, but one that sent ripples through the air, like the toll of a distant bell. Line by line, the women listed the wrongs they had lived. No right to vote, no right to their wages, no voice in laws that bound them, no respect from the institutions of higher learning. And then, near the end, came a demand that startled even some of the women in the room, the right to vote. It was too much for many. Too soon, they said. Too radical. Even some allies blinked at that sentence. Women voting. It felt impossible. Unnatural, some said. Dangerous, others whispered. But one voice in the room, Frederick Douglass, stood up. Yes, that Frederick Douglass. Formerly enslaved, now a powerful speaker and publisher. He told them that justice had no gender, that if a woman paid taxes, raised children, obeyed laws, then she had earned the right to help shape them. His words gave strength to theirs. By the end of the meeting, they took a vote. 68 women and 32 men signed the Declaration of Sentiments. Not many, perhaps, not compared to the whole country, but enough. Enough to plant a seed that would not go quietly back into the ground. Still, after the applause faded and the room emptied, the world outside did not change overnight. Newspapers mocked them. Some called the women ungrateful, unnatural, even dangerous to society. Others dismissed it as a strange event in a strange town, already forgotten by the next harvest. But the women remembered. They kept the minutes. They wrote letters. They held more meetings. And in the quiet corners of drawing rooms and churches, the words they had spoken in Seneca Falls kept echoing, like a song you cannot quite forget. You might remember hearing about it in school, or maybe not. Maybe it was one of those stories left out of the textbook or mentioned only in passing. But it happened. On a hot summer day, in a chapel with creaky floors and open windows, a group of women said, "We are here. We are not asking any more." When I think about that meeting, I do not picture a roar. I picture Elizabeth tired but certain, brushing crumbs off her skirt before standing to read her words. I picture Lucretia folding her hands calmly while others debated. I picture Frederick Douglass nodding just once as the vote passed. And I picture a young girl in the back row, no older than 12, clutching her mother's hand and wondering if this was what change looked like. Seneca Falls was not the end of anything. It was the beginning of a very long walk, through ridicule, through heartbreak, through silence and noise. But in that chapel, for just a moment, the future cracked open a little, and the wind that blew through the windows that day carried more than the scent of summer. It carried voices that would not be still again. Two sisters, two roads. I used to think of Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton as one name. You know the way some names come in pairs, like they were always meant to be said together. Susan and Elizabeth, like thunder and rain. You could not mention one without the other. But the truth is, they were very different women. They loved the same cause, but they walked to it from different roads. I first saw a photograph of them in a dusty museum tucked behind a courthouse in upstate New York. Two stern faces, black dresses, hair pinned tight. Neither of them smiled, but there was something in their eyes, something fierce, like the last coals of a fire refusing to go out. Elizabeth was the dreamer. She wrote with a poet's voice, bold and unafraid. Born in 1815, she had a sharp mind and a sharper tongue, and she was not afraid to use either. She studied Greek and Latin when most girls were still being taught needlepoint. She married late for her time and chose a husband who supported her mind, not just her manners. But even in that, she found the limits of her world. Raising 7 children, left her stuck at home, writing speeches she could not always give, waiting for someone else to deliver them to the crowd. That someone was often Susan. Susan was the organizer, the tireless traveler, the one who knocked on doors and handed out pamphlets until her fingers bled. Born 5 years after Elizabeth, she never married. She said she had no time for it. Instead, she poured everything she had into the movement. Train rides, hotel rooms, lecture halls that were half empty and half hostile. She once said, "I distrust those people who know so well what God wants them to do, because it always coincides with their own desires." That line still makes me smile. Together they made an unlikely but unstoppable pair. Elizabeth lit the fire. Susan carried the torch. They met in 1851. A friend introduced them on a street corner in Seneca Falls. From that day on, they wrote letters to each other for decades, hundreds of them. When they were apart, they sent pages full of strategy, gossip, frustration, and jokes. When they were together, they planned, and plotted, and argued sometimes. They were not always kind, but they were always honest. They founded the Revolution, a short-lived but fiery newspaper for women's rights. They started the National Woman Suffrage Association, determined to push for a constitutional amendment, not just local wins. They lobbied Congress. They wrote books. They endured insult after insult from newspapers and ministers who called them unnatural, unfeminine, ungodly. And they kept going. But even between them, there were differences. Elizabeth, in her later years, grew weary. She began to speak more broadly about women's freedom, not just the vote, but freedom in marriage, in religion, in thought. She published a book called The Woman's Bible, reinterpreting scripture through a feminist lens. It caused a storm. Even Susan distanced herself from it, worried it would harm the cause. Elizabeth stood her ground, but she also stood a little more alone. Susan, meanwhile, focused like a compass needle. The vote. That was the goal. Everything else could wait. She believed that if women could get the ballot, the rest would follow. She stayed the course, speaking until her voice cracked, traveling until her feet blistered, always in motion, always polite, but never backing down. I remember reading one of their letters written in shaky ink as both women aged. Elizabeth had lost a child. Susan had missed the funeral, tied up in meetings and speeches. "You are doing what must be done," Elizabeth wrote, "but I miss you all the same." That line felt heavy, like it had been folded and unfolded too many times. In 1872, Susan made national headlines by doing something both simple and illegal. She voted. She walked into a polling station in Rochester, New York, and cast her ballot in the presidential election. She was arrested 2 weeks later. At her trial, the judge refused to let her speak. At length, refused to let the jury deliberate. He found her guilty and fined her $100. She never paid. Elizabeth cheered her from afar. "You represent all of us," she wrote. They knew they would not live to see the victory. That was the hardest part. All the train rides, all the cold halls, all the speeches, they were planting seeds for someone else's harvest. Susan said it often. Failure is impossible. But she also knew that success might be too slow for their own lives to witness. Elizabeth died in 1902. Susan followed 4 years later. At her funeral, they read her favorite poems. No president attended. No national holiday was declared. The newspapers gave her a few inches of print, but her friends kept going. Her face was etched into the memories of the women who marched after her. Her name was whispered in the dark corners of organizing meetings. Her picture was taped inside desk drawers by women who would someday write laws of their own. And Elizabeth's words, those bold, inconvenient, brilliant words, still glowed on yellowed paper. The declaration of sentiments, the woman's Bible, the speeches written by hand, in the glow of a kitchen candle between the crying of children. 2 women, 2 roads, 1 fire between them. When I think of them now, I do not see them in the photographs, stern and silent. I imagine them walking side by side down a dirt path, Elizabeth talking too fast, Susan taking notes, both of them already thinking about the next town, the next meeting, the next girl who might hear their words and wonder, why not me? And maybe that girl is listening still. A vote for abolition. There was a time, maybe you remember hearing about it, when the fight for women's rights and the fight to end slavery walked hand in hand. For a little while they shared the same footsteps, the same halls, the same worn-out shoes, and for some, the same heartbreak. Before the word feminist ever made it to a headline, many of the women who would one day ask for the vote were asking for something else: freedom for others. Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott, you remember them. They did not start with women's suffrage. They started with abolition, with the simple idea that no human should be owned by another. They believed in freedom before they believed in equality, because freedom was the fire closest to their time. And it made sense. Women knew something about being voiceless. They understood what it meant to be treated as property, to be dismissed in the law, to have decisions made about your life without your input. So they stood beside the abolitionists. They organized meetings. They raised money. They spoke to angry crowds who did not want to hear about suffering unless it was neat and distant. They were there when Frederick Douglass took the stage. They were there when Sojourner Truth Tall, deep-voiced, unshakable, asked her famous question, "Ain't I a woman?" That line, so simple, so clear, cut through every argument about race and gender, like a blade through fog. Truth had been born into slavery. She had seen her children sold away from her, and she stood there wrapped in a shawl, speaking truth to a room that did not always know how to receive it. Women like Abby Kelly Foster and the Grimke sisters, Sarah and Angelina, risked everything. Their reputations, their families, even their churches turned on them. Angelina once addressed a crowd of both men and women, and it caused such scandal that ministers published open letters against her. But she kept going, because slavery was not a debate for her. It was a wound that bled every day. And yet something happened along the way. Something quiet. Something bitter. After the Civil War, the country stood at a crossroads. The 13th Amendment had ended slavery, at least on paper. And now came the question of who would be allowed to vote. The 15th Amendment was drafted, an amendment that would give the right to vote to men, regardless of race, but not to women, not even the white ones. And that is where the roads began to split. Some women were furious. How could a country that owed so much to its daughters still keep them silent? Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, women who had fought for abolition for decades, spoke out sharply. They asked why their loyalty was being repaid with exclusion. They wondered not kindly whether it was fair for uneducated black men to be given the vote before educated white women. It was a sentence that hurt, that haunted. Because in that moment, the movement cracked. Frederick Douglass, who had once stood with Stanton in Seneca Falls, now stood apart. He believed the vote for black men had to come first, that it was a matter of survival. The nation was lynching them, imprisoning them, stripping them of even the idea of citizenship. When women are hunted down like dogs, he said, then they will have an urgency as we do. It was not a dismissal. It was a plea. But it was heard by many women as betrayal. The suffrage movement, once broad and united, now split into 2 paths. One focused on universal suffrage, slowly, patiently. The other pushed hard for white women's votes and began to use language that played into the very racism they had once stood against. It is one of the hardest truths of the story, that in their hunger for justice, some women forgot what justice was made of. Not all of them. There were women, Black, Indigenous, and immigrant, who never stopped linking the causes. Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, Ida B. Wells, Mary Church Terrell. They fought for both racial and gender equality at the same time, knowing they could not afford to choose, but the spotlight rarely found them. History's ink was still mostly held by white hands. I remember reading a speech by Frances Harper once. She said, "We are all bound up together in one great bundle of humanity." A soft sentence, a hard truth, because even in the fight for rights, some hands let go of others. By the time the 15th Amendment passed in 1870, Black men could vote on paper, but women of all kinds remained in the shadows of polling places still silent, and soon after Jim Crow laws would begin to take even that paper right away. Susan and Elizabeth were devastated. They refused to support the amendment. They formed their own organization, the National Woman Suffrage Association, arguing that they could not support a law that wrote them out. Others, like Lucy Stone, chose to support it, hoping that one day women would follow. It was a painful divide, not just in strategy but in spirit. Friends became strangers. Letters stopped coming. Meetings broke apart. And the movement, once a rising wave, became two quieter streams. But history is full of these splits. Is it not full of choices made in the dim light of compromise? And sometimes people you admire say things you wish they had not, but they still lit the path, even if it flickered. Tonight I remember them all. The women who stood in abolition halls and suffrage tents, the ones who raised their voices, and the ones who were never allowed to. The movement was not perfect, but it was real, and it was brave, and it kept moving. Because justice, even when it stumbles, does not stop walking. When they laughed at Susan, I once saw a political cartoon from the 1870s. It showed Susan B. Anthony with a man's haircut and boots too big for her feet, standing at a ballot box. The caption called her unnatural, said she was trying to be what she could never be. I remember staring at it for a long time, not because it surprised me, but because it did not. People laughed at Susan B. Anthony, not always kindly, not always quietly. They laughed in editorials from pulpits and across dinner tables. They laughed when she stood on stage in drafty church halls, her voice flat but certain. They laughed when she spoke in towns that had never seen a woman talk politics without being interrupted. They laughed because they were afraid that one day she might be heard. And still she spoke. By the early 1870s, Susan had been fighting for women's suffrage for over 20 years. 20 years of train rides, of bad coffee in boarding houses, of sleeping in strange beds with windows that let the cold in. 20 years of being told no and never and not you. But she never stopped moving. In 1872, something changed. Or maybe Susan simply decided it had been long enough. That November, she walked into a barber shop in Rochester, New York. That was where the men went to vote in those days, the back room of a barber shop. She wore her best black dress, the one with the buttons that caught the morning light just right. She brought her sisters with her, and she cast a vote for president. Ulysses S. Grant, if you are wondering. She voted for him. She knew it was illegal, but she also knew it was right. The local election officials let it happen. Maybe they were unsure. Maybe they were amused. Maybe they did not want to argue with a woman who spoke like she had already won. But a few days later, a warrant was issued. And 2 weeks after she cast that ballot, a U.S. Marshal knocked on her door. She invited him in. She was always polite. When he told her she was under arrest, she said simply, "Is that so?" Then she asked if she could bring her knitting. They took her by carriage to the courthouse. On the way there, she gave a speech to the crowd that had gathered on the street. It was not planned. It just happened. That was the kind of woman she was, the kind who made courtrooms nervous. At her trial, the judge was not interested in listening. He directed the jury to find her guilty before they even left their seats. Then he fined her $100. Susan stood up and said she would never pay it, and she never did. She could have gone to jail, but they did not send her. Maybe they were afraid of what more attention might do. Maybe they thought the story would fade, that people would forget. But Susan did not forget, and neither did the women who heard her name whispered in the years to come. The newspapers, of course, had a field day. They printed caricatures with thick lines and cruel smiles. They called her a criminal, a spinster, a fool. Some said she was trying to destroy the family. Others claimed she just wanted attention. But underneath the mockery was something else: fear. Fear that if one woman could vote, others would follow. That the walls might crack. That the world might have to make room. Susan took the laughter and folded it into her speeches. She quoted the insults back to the crowds. She let them echo in the halls, because she knew what they really meant. Laughter, after all, is often just fear in costume. She kept going, speaking, organizing, traveling. Her shoes wore thin. Her voice grew hoarse. Her hair went white. But her spine never bent. Once someone asked her how she managed all those years without giving up. She replied, "I never thought of myself. I only thought of the cause." But she must have felt it. The loneliness, the years ticking by without change, the letters unanswered, the halls only half full, the vote still just out of reach. She lived long enough to see a national amendment proposed, but not passed. Long enough to know that her name was written into the bill, but also long enough to know it might not become law in her lifetime. She died in 1906 at the age of 86. On her nightstand was a stack of letters from women all across the country, teachers, factory workers, farm wives, thanking her for showing them how to speak, how to stand, how to keep going when the world laughed in your face. At her funeral, they did not ring church bells. There were no flags at half-mast. But in small towns and big cities, women paused. They remembered the woman who had once dared to walk into a barber shop and cast a vote like it was the most natural thing in the world. And someday, it would be. But that is a story still waiting, just a few pages ahead. Tonight, let us sit with Susan for a little while longer. Let us picture her in that courtroom, standing straight in a dress too plain for history books, telling a judge she would not pay a penny for the crime of having a voice. Let us remember that even when the world laughs at you, you can still speak clearly. And sometimes, that is when your voice is loudest. Marching without music. Not every part of a movement comes with banners and crowds. Sometimes the hardest parts are the years no one writes about, the quiet stretches between speeches, the decades where nothing big seems to change but people keep walking anyway. That is what the late 1800s were for the women's suffrage movement. A long, slow march. No music, just footsteps on dusty roads, letters written by hand meetings in borrowed rooms with flickering lamps. The kind of years where you wonder if anyone is still listening. After Susan B. Anthony cast her illegal vote and faced the court, there was no great uprising, no wave of new laws. The newspapers moved on. The country looked elsewhere. And yet, the women did not stop. They could not. They kept organizing conventions. Albany, Des Moines, St. Louis, Every year they gathered in stiff dresses carrying binders filled with names and speeches, and asked again, "Why not us?" There were no microphones, no radios, no television cameras, just voices carried across wooden halls that smelled of dust and sweat. They took turns at the podium, sometimes speaking to 10 people, sometimes 50, sometimes just 2. They spoke anyway. Susan B. Anthony was still there. Older now, her hair pulled back tighter, her posture a little more rigid. She became a fixture, known, predictable, steady. People called her Aunt Susan. Children looked up from their homework when she passed, and she kept records, stacks of them, petitions signed by thousands of women, letters to Congress, testimonies to state legislatures, carefully typed, bound with ribbon, stored in boxes she carried herself. But even Susan knew the weight of time. In 1890, 2 rival suffrage organizations, the ones that had split years earlier over the 15th Amendment, finally came back together. The National American Woman Suffrage Association was born, a long name, but a necessary unity. They needed each other. A new generation was coming too. Women born after the Civil War. Some had gone to college, some were doctors. Some had ridden bicycles in bloomers and felt for the first time what freedom felt like in the wind. But still the vote was out of reach. One by one, the older leaders began to fade. Lucy Stone died in 1893. Elizabeth Cady Stanton passed away in 1902. Susan B. Anthony followed in 1906. It felt like the light in the old house was dimming room by room, and yet the doors stayed open. Women like Anna Howard Shaw and Carrie Chapman Catt stepped forward. New voices, new energy. But they inherited a movement tired from the years, still mocked by the press, still dismissed by politicians, still climbing the same hill. The country was changing around them. Industrial cities, rising immigration, booming technology, humming louder every day. But the women's vote. Still no, one by one, they tried the states. Some Western territories gave in: Wyoming in 1869, then Colorado in 1893, Utah and Idaho not long after. It gave them hope. If they could win one state at a time, maybe that would be enough. Maybe they could build a patchwork of rights that would one day cover the whole country. But the East Coast was stubborn. New York refused. So did Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, and Ohio. Big states, big power, closed doors. Still the women marched. Not with parades, not yet. These were the silent years, the walking years, the years of handing out pamphlets to men who would not look them in the eye, the years of writing letters that went unanswered, the years of being told, "Not now. Maybe later. Be patient." And patience, as it turns out, has a sound. It is the scratch of pen on paper at midnight. It is the hush of skirts on marble floors. It is the creak of chairs at town halls where no one claps. But it is also the sound of feet, still moving, still marching. I once read a note from a woman named Mary, written in 1898. She said, "No one talks about our meetings anymore. The papers do not come. But I believe one day they will. I do not know when. I only know I must keep showing up." I wonder if she knew how much that mattered, because these quiet years were not empty. They were the roots, deep, unseen, strong, holding the movement steady while it waited for the next storm, and storm it would, but not yet. So tonight, let us remember the women who kept walking when the world had stopped listening. The ones who organized bake sales to fund printing costs, who stitched their own banners, who spent their evenings reading legal briefs by candlelight, who raised children by day and fought for the vote by night. They are the ones who did not make headlines, but they made history. They marched without music, but their footsteps never lost the beat. New faces, new fire. There is something about a movement that has lived too long in silence. Eventually, someone walks in, throws open a window and says, "Enough." And the dust starts to stir again. That was what the early 1900s felt like for the women's suffrage movement. After decades of slow steps and quiet patience, a new generation arrived, and they were not interested in waiting their turn. They came with short hair, quicker words, and sharper signs. They had read Susan B. Anthony's speeches, yes, but they wanted more than admiration. They wanted action. And at the front of them, carrying both a banner and a plan, was Alice Paul. You may have heard her name once, maybe in a footnote or a faded textbook. But Alice was no footnote. She was thunder under a calm sky. A Quaker by birth, small in frame, but made of something solid. Steel, maybe, or something older. She had studied in England and learned from the British suffragettes, who were not afraid to go to jail or to throw a rock through a window, if that was what it took. Alice saw women handcuffed for holding signs. She saw them force-fed through tubes when they refused to eat in prison. And instead of turning away, she took notes. When she came back to America, the movement here felt slow to her. Careful, too careful, respectable suits, polite applause. Alice wanted results. She joined the National American Woman Suffrage Association, the same group Susan B. Anthony had helped build. But she quickly realized their pace and hers were not the same. So, like many who find the house too quiet, she left and built her own. In 1916, Alice founded the National Woman's Party. The name was plain. The tactics were not. With her closest ally, Lucy Burns, a red-haired, sharp-eyed woman with a gift for organizing, they planned something no one had done before a picket of the White House. You have to picture it. It was winter. Washington, D.C., bitter cold wind slicing off the Potomac. And there they stood, dozens of women dressed in long coats and gloves, holding signs that asked simple questions. "Mr. President, how long must women wait for liberty?" They stood there every day. Rain, snow, silence. They called themselves the Silent Sentinels, and they meant it. Woodrow Wilson, the president at the time, was not pleased. At first he ignored them. Then he chuckled at them. Then he tried to dismiss them as a stunt. But they did not go away. Newspapers called them disgraceful. Some passers-by tore signs from their hands. Others threw garbage. But still, the women returned, day after day, month after month. And then came the arrests. The police began picking them up, charging them with obstructing traffic. A laughable charge considering they stood still and silent. But the message was clear: enough of your questions, enough of your waiting. The women were sent to the Occoquan workhouse, a grim gray place with metal beds and rough hands. They were not treated as political prisoners, but as troublemakers. Some were beaten, others were thrown into dark cells. And when they refused to eat, protesting their unjust arrests, they were force-fed through tubes shoved up their noses or down their throats. It was not medicine, it was punishment. And yet, they endured it, quietly, with steel in their bones. One night later, called the Night of Terror, guards dragged Lucy Burns from her cell, chained her hands above her head, and left her hanging there for hours. Another woman, Dora Lewis, was knocked unconscious. When her cellmate thought she had died, she screamed for help. No one came. But the news did. Word of the brutality slipped out. Photographs appeared in papers. Women wrote editorials, gave interviews, shared their scars. And suddenly, the country began to see. These were not radicals. These were daughters, sisters, neighbors, asking for the vote and paying for it in bruises. Alice Paul, still in prison, was moved to a psychiatric ward. Officials said she was unstable, that no woman could starve herself for justice and still be sane. she replied softly. Is it not the height of insanity to deny half the population a voice in its own government? Eventually, the pressure grew too much. The women were released, charges dropped, no apology given, but no apology needed. They had made their point, and they did not stop. The National Woman's Party kept pushing. Marches grew larger, signs grew bolder, the old slogans sharpened their edges. There was no more waiting, only walking forward. The older generation watched all this with mixed eyes. Some admired the fire. Others worried it would burn the whole house down. But change rarely asks for permission. Alice and her sisters in protest had learned something important. The world does not always move for petitions. Sometimes it moves when silence stands too still to ignore. So tonight, remember them. The women who left warm homes to stand in bitter cold, who went to jail so others might go to the polls, who tied their lives to a banner that read only one word: votes. And beneath that word was a question. Simple, heavy, one that still echoes. If not now, when? The picket line that did not break. I once stood in front of the White House on a quiet Tuesday morning. The sky was gray, the kind of soft gray that makes everything feel a little farther away. Tourists were taking photos. A child fed breadcrumbs to pigeons. No one spoke much. But I could not help thinking about the women who had once stood in that very same spot, silent still and entirely uninvited. It was 1917, and the war in Europe had swallowed the headlines. American boys were being drafted, shipped across the ocean to fight in muddy trenches and foreign languages. The country was tense, patriotic, nervous, and into that tension walked the women of the National Woman's Party, holding signs in black letters and winter gloves. They had been protesting peacefully for months, asking President Wilson why democracy abroad mattered more than democracy at home. Mr. President, how long must women wait for liberty? One banner read. Another simply said, Kaiser Wilson, a sharp jab comparing the president to the German emperor. That one did not go over well. Crowds began to gather. Angry ones, men in uniform, boys with clenched fists. They jeered, shouted, sometimes worse. They tore signs out of women's hands and ripped them into pieces. One woman, Lucy Burns, was grabbed by the collar and dragged down the sidewalk before the police even blinked. But the picket line held. The women came back the next day, and the day after that, and the day after that. Washington, D.C. is not kind in winter. The wind off the river cuts through wool, but they stood there in the cold coats buttoned to the throat, mouths closed, eyes forward. They did not chant. They did not shout. They simply stood as if their presence alone was a question no one wanted to answer. Eventually, the arrests began again. At first, the charges were small obstructing traffic, unlawful assembly. But the sentences grew harsher. Some women were given 60 days in prison. Others were sent straight to the Occoquan workhouse, the same grim place that had tried to break them before. Inside, things were worse than before. They were denied visitors, denied lawyers, forced into filthy cells, given food not fit for animals. One woman wrote later that the bread was covered in mildew. Another said the water smelled of rust. When they protested by refusing to eat, the guards answered with violence. Force-feeding returned rubber tubes, metal clamps, bruises, left by restraints. The women were treated not as citizens with rights, but as problems to be managed, and yet still, they refused to be silent. Word of the arrests spread. The newspapers could not ignore it anymore. Photos of bruised women and broken banners appeared on front pages. Letters poured into Congress. Ministers spoke out from pulpits. Even those who had once rolled their eyes began to shift in their chairs. Back on the outside, Alice Paul kept the line alive. She was arrested too, of course. They tried to break her spirit by moving her to a psychiatric ward. They called her hysterical, unfit, dangerous. But she was none of those things. She was calm, she was clear, and she was unyielding. In her small cell, she wrote on scraps of paper smuggled notes to friends, plotted next steps. She would later say, "They thought they were dealing with a firecracker. They did not know they had locked up a volcano." The government had hoped the movement would fade, that the public would tire of the stories, that the women would give up or turn on each other. But none of that happened. The picket line, though thinned by arrests, never disappeared. Others stepped in. New faces, same resolve. A school teacher from Kansas, a widow from Chicago, a factory worker from Pittsburgh. They had never met Susan B. Anthony. They had never attended a convention. But they knew what they stood for, and they stood. Through rain, through hate, through silence. One woman, Mabel Vernon, was asked by a reporter why she kept returning to the White House fence after being arrested twice. She said, "Because I remember my mother's voice, and I want my daughter to hear mine." That is what it was in the end. Not just protest, not just policy, but voice. The kind passed down like a song you hum without knowing where it came from. The kind that lingers. By late 1917, the pressure was too much. The Wilson administration quietly ordered the release of the prisoners. The courts began overturning the charges, and President Wilson, who had once dismissed the picketers as a nuisance, now spoke to Congress in favor of women's suffrage. Not because he had changed his heart, perhaps, but because he could not ignore their presence anymore. That is what the picket line did, not with volume, but with insistence. It reminded the world that silence can speak, that standing still can move a nation. So the next time you walk past a fence, any fence, and see someone standing there holding a sign, not saying a word, do not look away too quickly. You might be looking at history waiting to be written. The night of silence. I remember once years ago staying overnight in an old train station that had been turned into a museum. They let me sleep on a cot near the baggage room just for one night. The building creaked. The windows moaned. It was not the kind of silence that makes you feel calm. It was the kind that feels like something is waiting to be remembered. That was the kind of silence the women faced in the Occoquan workhouse in November of 1917. After months of peaceful protest, after banners and bruises, after arrests that made no sense to anyone who was really listening, they were locked away behind iron bars and concrete walls, and the world for a time went quiet again. But this silence was different, heavier. Not the stillness of peace, but the hush of something being hidden. They called it the Night of Terror. 33 women were brought into the prison that evening. It was cold. They were not given blankets. Their cells were filthy. The guards said there were too many of them, so some were thrown into rooms already full. No introductions, no explanations. The women asked for basic things: water, paper, the right to speak to a lawyer. They were ignored. Or worse. Lucy Burns, who had once organized marches with perfect precision, was dragged by her wrists and chained to the bars of her cell with her hands above her head. She stood like that for hours. When a guard finally came to check on her, she simply whispered, "I will not eat." Dora Lewis was slammed against the wall so hard that her cellmate thought she had died. She screamed for help. No one answered. Another woman was thrown onto an iron bed frame. Her head struck the metal. Blood ran. Still no one came. They had done nothing violent, nothing illegal really. They had held signs, asked questions, demanded a voice, and for that, They were treated as enemies. Later, some officials would say the guards were overwhelmed, that things got out of hand. But the women knew better. It was not chaos. It was message. It was the system saying, "This is what happens when you do not stay quiet." They tried to make the women recant, tried to make them sign statements of apology, but most refused, even in pain, even with swollen hands and bruised faces. They said no. Some stopped eating, not out of despair, but out of defiance. Hunger strikes they knew would bring attention, would force the world to look, and the world did begin to look. Word leaked out. One letter, then another, then photographs. A lawyer smuggled notes to reporters. Soon stories began to appear, not in the back pages, but in bold print. People were horrified. Senators asked questions. Ministers wrote sermons. Mothers asked their daughters, "Is this what you want to be part of?" And some daughters answered yes. In court, the government tried to say the women had brought it on themselves, that they had provoked the trouble, that they were being dramatic. But the bruises said otherwise. The hollow cheeks, the trembling hands. Alice Paul, still in prison, was being held in a psychiatric ward. They thought they could discredit her that way. Say she was mad. Say she needed help, not votes. But she wrote every day. Scribbled on scraps of paper. Sent messages through cracks in the system. She even managed to give interviews. When asked what she wanted, she said, "Only the rights I was promised at birth." That sentence found its way into newspapers across the country. And slowly the silence began to shift. It cracked, like ice underfoot in spring. You cannot always hear it, but you can feel it. In late November, under mounting pressure, the prisoners were released. Quietly. No apologies, no explanations. Just doors unlocked and rides offered back into a world that was not quite the same. When Lucy Burns stepped out of the prison gates, her first question was whether the others had held the line. They had. Of course they had. The night of terror did not break them. It revealed them. It showed the world what kind of courage lived behind the word suffragist. Not the polite kind, not the decorative kind, but the kind you could not chain without consequence. And that night, in a dark corridor, with no witnesses but the bruised and the brave, the vote began to feel less like a dream and more like a debt. A debt the country would soon have to pay. So tonight, as you rest, think of those 33 women, not just what they endured, but what they carried out with them. Not just pain, but proof. That silence, when chosen, is powerful. But when forced, it becomes a weapon. And still they did not break. They did not raise fists. They raised voices. And the echo of that night still moves quietly through time. The President's Dilemma. There is a moment in every story where someone stands at a door, hand on the knob, unsure whether to open it. For President Woodrow Wilson, that door was women's suffrage. And for years, he just stood there. Wilson was not a villain, in the way stories often paint one. He was thoughtful, deliberate, soft-spoken, a former professor. He believed in process, in patience, in the idea that big change should come slowly like tea steeping in warm water. But the women standing outside his White House were not in the mood for tea. At first, he tried to ignore them. The picketers, the signs, the banners comparing him to foreign tyrants. He called them a distraction, said the timing was wrong. America was at war after all. There were soldiers in France battles to win newspapers full of headlines he could not control. But the women stayed. They stood outside in the snow while his carriage passed. They stood in the rain as guests arrived for state dinners. They stood on the hot bricks of July while the windows of the White House stayed closed. Inside, Wilson could hear the noise or the lack of it. That was the thing. They did not chant. They did not sing. They just stood. And somehow that silence was louder than shouting. He began to feel the pressure, not just from the women, from his own party, from foreign governments watching him speak about democracy, while his own citizens were jailed for asking for a vote, from his wife and daughters who read the newspapers and did not always agree with him, from a nation growing restless. Then came the night of terror. The photos, the bruises, the force-feeding, the testimonies of well-dressed women treated like criminals. Wilson may have believed in patience, but patience has its limits when the public begins to shift. He met with suffrage leaders behind closed doors. Politely, firmly. He said the time would come. He reminded them that states could decide, that the Constitution was a slow machine. That change had to be earned carefully. But the women had already earned it with hunger strikes and handcuffs. Carrie Chapman Catt, who led the more traditional wing of the movement, understood how to talk to him. She appealed to reason, to history, to legacy. She showed him maps of Western states where women already voted. She argued that if the nation was fighting for democracy abroad, it could not deny it at home. And slowly the door began to creak open. In January of 1918, President Wilson finally stepped before Congress and asked them to pass the women's suffrage amendment. He called it an act of justice, of wartime necessity. He used careful words, but the meaning was clear. It was the first time an American president had openly supported a constitutional amendment for women's right to vote. Not everyone was impressed. The National Woman's Party called it too little, too late. Alice Paul, who had spent time in prison during his presidency, refused to attend the speech. Others cheered. The press debated whether he was leading or simply following. But history is not always tidy. Sometimes the people who open doors are the same ones who once kept them shut. The House of Representatives passed the amendment by the required 2/3 vote. Barely. The Senate took longer. Months longer. Wilson lobbied them, wrote letters, made calls. Some senators changed their votes. Some did not. In the meantime, the picketers kept returning. It became a dance. The president offering measured support. The women demanding more. Congress inching forward. The nation watching. And all the while, the war dragged on. Some said the women should have waited, that it was selfish to push for votes during a global crisis. But the women knew better. They knew that wars were always used as excuses to delay equality. That if they waited now, they might be waiting forever. One senator, when asked why he opposed the amendment, said flatly, "Because if women vote, they will expect to be listened to." He was not wrong. In the fall of 1918, the Senate failed to pass the amendment by just 2 votes. Wilson was disappointed. The women were furious, but neither side quit. The war ended that November. The soldiers began to return home, and with peace came a new question. What had they fought for, if not for a country that listened to all its people? Wilson knew he would be remembered for the war, for the League of Nations, for the speeches. But deep down, I think he also knew the women would be remembered too, and maybe longer. By 1919, the tide finally turned. The House passed the amendment again. The Senate, after another grueling fight, followed, and then it went to the states. But that is a story for another night. Tonight, let us linger in that long hallway, outside the president's office. Let us picture him at his desk papers stacked high, the air thick with the scent of ink and rain. Let us imagine him pausing not just because of politics, but because of conscience. Because in the quiet moments between meetings, he might have remembered their faces. The women outside his gates, the silence that did not bend, the picket line that did not break. The vote that took a war. I used to know a woman named Helen who kept a photograph of her grandmother framed in the hallway. The photo was small, black and white, with a little tear at the edge, like someone had folded it too many times. Her grandmother wore a nurse's uniform, high collar, long sleeves, the kind with buttons all the way to the chin. Helen told me she never talked much about the war, but she always said she came home different. World War I changed everything, not just borders and maps and politics. It changed people, and for American women it changed the way the country saw them. When the war broke out, thousands of women volunteered. They were not asked. No one handed them invitations, but they showed up anyway, as nurses, clerks, ambulance drivers. Some crossed the Atlantic to serve near the front lines, bandaging wounds that no textbook had prepared them for. Others stayed home and ran farms, built planes, stitched uniforms, typed orders. They filled the spaces men had left behind, not because they wanted to prove anything, but because someone had to. In Washington, offices buzzed with women handling logistics for the war effort. In factories, they worked 12-hour shifts, building machines of war with hands that had once sewn dresses and packed school lunches. And in hospitals, they stood for hours beside beds lined wall to wall, tending to soldiers who sometimes could not speak or breathe or forget. They did not march, they did not shout, but they worked, and that work spoke louder than any banner. President Wilson saw it. He could not see it. The country leaned on its women in those years like never before, and it changed the tone of the conversation. In 1918, Wilson addressed the Senate and made his case again for women's suffrage, not as a favor, not as a concession, but as a debt. "We have made partners of the women in this war," he said. "Shall we admit them only to a partnership of suffering and sacrifice and toil, and not to a partnership of privilege and right?" It was a question the room could not easily answer. The tide began to shift. States that had resisted for decades started to reconsider. Politicians who once laughed at suffragists now offered cautious support, not because they had changed their minds entirely, but because the country had changed around them. Still, it was not easy. The amendment, simple in words but heavy in meaning, had to pass both houses of Congress by a 2/3 majority. In the House, it squeaked by. Barely. The floor vote was tense. Some members changed their votes at the last minute. Others left the chamber entirely to avoid being recorded. But it passed. The Senate was tougher. It failed the first time, passed the second by just 2 votes. One senator was wheeled in on a stretcher from a hospital. Another arrived by train after recovering from surgery. That was what it took. And then the long road to ratification began. 36 states would need to approve the amendment for it to become law. Some said yes quickly, Illinois, Wisconsin, Michigan. Others said no, just as quickly, Georgia, Alabama, South Carolina. The battle moved state to state like a traveling show with too much at stake. In each capital, women lobbied, testified, and waited. They stood in the rain outside courthouses counting votes, with fingers crossed in gloves worn thin. In some places, it was over in a day. In others, it dragged on for months. It was not just politics anymore. It was personal. Daughters wrote letters to fathers in legislatures. Wives argued with husbands across dinner tables. Newspapers printed cartoons on both sides, some respectful, many cruel. Ministers gave sermons. Teachers led debates. And always the question remained, should women have the vote? By the summer of 1920, 35 states had ratified the amendment. Just one more needed. The final battle would take place in a state known more for music and mountains than for politics, Tennessee. But that is a story for another night. Tonight I want you to remember the women who did not fight with fists or rifles, but with patience and presence. The ones who stood in hospital corridors and factory lines, who kept the books and kept the farms, who walked into jobs they had never trained for and left behind every doubt the country had about their strength. They did not demand the vote because of what they endured. They demanded it because they had proved without speeches or marches that they were already part of the country's beating heart. They held it together while it fought itself. And in the quiet after the guns fell silent, they asked softly but clearly, "Now will you hear us?" Tennessee's tiebreaker. There are moments in history that sound too quiet at first. No flags, no music, just a paper in a hand, a name called in a crowded room, a vote marked by a boy barely old enough to shave. But those are the moments that change everything. By the summer of 1920, the fight for women's suffrage had come down to a single state. 35 had said yes, 12 had said no, and only Tennessee stood undecided. One more yes would write the 19th Amendment into the Constitution. One more no would stall it, perhaps for years. The entire country turned to Nashville. It was August, and the city baked under the southern sun. Lawmakers gathered in suits that stuck to their backs, fanning themselves with folded newspapers. Suffragists filled the hotels wearing white dresses and yellow roses, the symbol of the yes vote. Their opponents wore red roses pinned proudly to their lapels. They called it the War of the Roses. Lobbyists crowded the hallways of the state capitol. Telegrams poured in by the hour from governors' ministers, veterans' business owners. Some begged the legislators to vote for progress. Others warned them to protect tradition. Rumors flew like mosquitoes in the heat, that votes were being bought, that arms were being twisted, that deals were being whispered in stairwells and over breakfast plates. And somewhere in the middle of all this stood a young man named Harry Byrne. He was 24 years old, the youngest member of the Tennessee House of Representatives, from a small town, quiet, bookish. Most people did not expect much from him. He wore a red rose on his jacket, like many others. That meant he planned to vote no. But on the morning of the vote, Harry Byrne opened a letter from his mother. Her name was Feb Ensminger Byrne, a farmer's widow, sharp-tongued, soft-hearted, and politically aware. In her careful handwriting, she wrote, "Hurrah, and vote for suffrage. Don't forget to be a good boy, and help Mrs. Cat." That was it. A few words, a mother's nudge, not a command, just a reminder of who had raised him. The vote began. Tension so thick, it might as well have been smoke. The Speaker of the House had expected a tie, and in that case the amendment would fail. He was ready for celebration. But when Harry Byrne's name was called, something shifted. He paused. Then he said, "Aye." Just like that. The chamber erupted, stunned silence, then shouting. Some thought he had misspoken. Others thought he had betrayed them. A few tried to chase him down the hallway afterward. He had to escape through a window and hide in the attic until things calmed down. Later, when asked why he changed his vote, Harry said, "I knew that a mother's advice is always safest for a boy to follow." He smiled when he said it, but he meant every word. That one "I" broke the deadlock. The 19th Amendment passed. The papers ran the headline the next morning, "Women Win Vote." It looked so simple in ink, so final. But behind it were 72 years of speeches, marches, hunger strikes, jail time, broken friendships, worn shoes, and the quiet voices of millions of women who had never stopped asking, "When will you hear us?" When the news reached Alice Paul, she hung a banner from the window of the National Woman's Party headquarters. It had 36 stars, one for each state, that had ratified. She stood beside it silently, her hands clasped her face, unreadable. Susan B. Anthony never lived to see that banner. Neither did Elizabeth Cady Stanton, or Sojourner Truth, or Lucy Stone. But their names were there in the silence, in the ink, in the space between the vote and the page. Some women wept. Some simply sat down. Others went right back to work, because they knew the vote was not the end. It was the beginning of responsibility. The story of that day in Nashville does not often make it into the big history books, but it lingers, like the scent of summer on old wood floors, like a mother's voice in a letter, like a boy in a red rose saying yes when it mattered most. So tonight, as you settle in, picture that chamber. Picture the sweat on collars, the rustle of paper fans, the creak of chairs as names were called. Picture Harry Byrne, fingers folded over a letter in his pocket, thinking not about history, but about home. And remember this: sometimes all it takes to move a nation is one quiet voice that chooses courage, even if that voice cracks a little when it says I. The year of the whisper. The headlines called it a victory, a triumph, a revolution sealed in ink. But if you had stepped into the living rooms and kitchens of America that fall, you would not have heard trumpets. You would have heard something softer, like the sound of paper ballots sliding into wooden boxes, like the rustle of coats and gloves as women stood quietly in line. The 19th Amendment had passed. But change, real change, never arrives all at once. It arrives like autumn, one leaf at a time. In cities, women walked into polling places for the first time, clutching purses and umbrellas, their spines straighter than usual. Some brought their daughters. Some came alone. And many came with no instruction, no guidebook, no example to follow. Because they were the example now. There were no tutorials on how to vote, no pamphlets that explained what each office meant. Many women had spent their lives barred from these conversations, from newspapers, from debate halls, from dinner tables where decisions were made. But they showed up anyway. In New York, a grandmother named Sarah cast her first vote at 76. In Kansas, a farm girl voted before her wedding. In Mississippi, a school teacher arrived before the polling station even opened her shoes, still dusty from walking 10 miles to get there. And in Tennessee, sweet sweltering Tennessee, the lines curled around the courthouse steps. Most men were polite. Some were not. A few whispered that the world had changed too much, that maybe it was time to go back to simpler days. But the women did not answer. They just stood their ground, hands in pockets, breath clouding in the chill of November. That election marked the first time that more than 8 million women voted in the United States. Some were met with flowers, others with glares, but all were met with ballots. It was not perfect. Native American women still could not vote. Neither could many Asian immigrants. And for Black women in the South, the right was written on paper, but erased in practice. They faced literacy tests designed to confuse, poll taxes designed to exclude, and threats, quiet or not, that reminded them their presence was not welcome. But they showed up too. They brought folding chairs and snacks. They came in groups humming old hymns. They wore Sunday hats and firm expressions. They waited 12 hours if they had to. Because the right to vote was not a gift. It was a fight, and they were not done fighting. One woman in Georgia was turned away 7 times. She came back 8. Meanwhile, newspapers ran columns debating whether the country would fall apart now that women had a say in it. Some men predicted chaos. Others predicted tea parties in Congress. But most just kept watching, wondering what it would mean for families, for laws for the future. But if you had asked the women themselves, they would have told you. It meant they had finally joined the conversation, not just about recipes and children and ribbons and lace, but about taxes and wages and war and peace and who gets to write the laws that shape a life. Alice Paul, ever composed, took the occasion to draft the Equal Rights Amendment. She believed voting was only the first step. Equality before the law was the goal. And so even as the ink dried on the 19th Amendment, She picked up her pen again. Others shifted focus too. Labor laws, birth control access, education. The vote was not the end of the journey. It was a key. And behind that first door were many more. But for one brief moment in that fall of 1920, it was enough to breathe. To walk into a voting booth with steady hands. To see your name on a registration list. To feel that what you thought, what you believed, mattered. A whisper turned into a ripple. And in homes across America, daughters watched their mothers step forward. Not loud, not angry, just certain. Like it had always been meant to be this way. Later, many women would write in diaries about that day. Some entries were one line long. Just I voted today. Others stretched for pages, talking about the sky, the clerk's tie, the creak of the booth door. Because sometimes history feels so quiet when it finally arrives that you wonder if anyone else noticed. But they did. They always do. So tonight, as you rest, picture that November. Picture the wind pulling scarves from shoulders, the sound of shoes on courthouse stairs, the soft click of buttons on a coat right before stepping into a place once closed. And remember, change does not always shout. Sometimes it just waits patiently at the edge of the morning, holding a small piece of paper ready to begin. Not yet equal. You might think that 1920 was the end of the story, that the vote meant equality, that the fight was finally over. But if you listen closely to the years that followed, you will not hear celebration. You will hear the sound of shoes still moving forward. Because while the door had opened, many found, there were still rooms they could not enter. The 19th Amendment gave women the right to vote, but not all women. Not yet. In the South, Jim Crow laws still wrapped themselves tightly around polling places, especially for black women. It did not matter what the Constitution said. If you arrived with dark skin, there was always a reason to be turned away. A spelling test, a history quiz, a tax, or just a look that said, "Do not try." Fannie Lou Hamer would be born in 1917. She was only 3 when the vote passed. She would not be allowed to cast her own until she was in her 40s. That is how long the lie lasted. In the West, Native American women waited even longer. The Indian Citizenship Act of 1924 gave them legal citizenship, but many states found ways to keep them out of the ballot box anyway. In Arizona, it was 1948 before their votes began to count. In New Mexico, it took even longer. Asian American women faced a similar silence. Many were denied citizenship altogether, and without citizenship there was no right to vote. It was not until 1952 that many could claim both a home and a voice in the country they lived in. And immigrant women, especially those from Southern and Eastern Europe, were often seen as suspect too. Foreign, too poor, too uneducated to be trusted with the vote. Never mind that they raised children here, built lives here, paid taxes here. The rules shifted beneath their feet. So in the years after 1920, the movement did not disappear. It changed shape. Some women focused on literacy drives, helping others learn how to pass those cruel tests. Others raised funds to pay poll taxes. They drove neighbors to registration offices, waited in long lines, filled out paperwork by candlelight. They whispered instructions across church pews, printed guides on mimeograph machines, in basements, knocked on doors with worn-out shoes and tired voices. It was slow work, quiet work, but it mattered. Meanwhile, Alice Paul and the National Woman's Party were already looking further. The Equal Rights Amendment. 3 short lines that promised full equality under the law. No exceptions, no loopholes, no asterisks. Not everyone agreed. Some women's groups feared that an Equal Rights Amendment would undo hard-won labor protections, shorter work hours, maternity laws, protections against dangerous factory jobs. They worried that total equality on paper might erase the few kindnesses reality had granted. So, a split began. The suffrage sisterhood frayed, and in homes across America, women tried to make sense of it. How to celebrate a right that still excluded so many, how to keep moving forward when even allies disagreed on the direction. Still they marched. In 1923, on the anniversary of the Seneca Falls Convention, the Equal Rights Amendment was introduced in Congress for the first time. It would not pass. Not then. Not for a long, long time. But it had entered the room, and like every whisper before it, it waited. The 1920s brought other changes too. Women ran for office. Not many, but enough to raise eyebrows. They joined juries in some states, entered law schools, became doctors, reporters, pilots, teachers with tenure, union leaders, scientists, and still wives, mothers, daughters, neighbors. Because identity is never one thing, no matter how neat the headlines try to make it. The nation called them modern women, flappers, suffragists, reformers, trouble. They called themselves citizens. In Harlem, Zora Neale. Hurston wrote stories that made people squirm. In Chicago, Ida B. Wells kept publishing even when presses were threatened. In Washington, Mary McLeod Bethune advised presidents. In San Francisco, women translated for immigrant families who had no one else. The vote had opened a door, but these women stepped through every hallway they could find. Still, it was not easy, for many marriage laws still tied a woman's legal identity to her husband. Wages were lower, bank accounts were often off limits, birth control was hard to find, and talking about it could get you arrested. Domestic violence was not spoken of, except in hushes and hints. But they kept going. Because once you have tasted change, silence feels heavier. So the 1920s passed, not with fireworks but with footsteps. Small, determined, relentless. And by the time the decade ended, the map of womanhood in America had shifted again. So tonight, as you drift into sleep, picture those years. Picture the back rooms and chalkboards, the piles of envelopes stamped and sealed, the door-to-door walks with aching feet, the meetings where coffee was poured into chipped cups and ideas passed between tired hands. The vote was just one chapter, and the book was still being written. The women who ran, they said it could not be done, that politics was no place for a lady, that the halls of power were meant for men with deep voices and deeper pockets. But they said that before, about voting, about speaking, about learning, and every time a woman had stepped forward anyway. So after 1920, women did more than cast ballots. They put their names on them. The very first to sit in Congress was Jeannette Rankin. You might remember her. She had won her seat in Montana even before the vote was national, and after the amendment passed, she returned. This time as a symbol, a reminder that women could do more than watch. They could lead. In 1922, Rebecca Felton of Georgia was appointed to the Senate just for a single day. A gesture, perhaps, but it still counted. For 24 hours, a woman sat where none had sat before. And then came the others. Ruth Hannah McCormick, May Ella Nolan, Florence Prague Kahn. Their names rarely made headlines. Their speeches were short, their offices modest. But they showed up, and that changed everything. They had to fight double, once for their party, then for their gender. Reporters asked them about their clothes, more than their policies. Some voters refused to shake their hands, but they kept running. In city councils and school boards, state houses, and mayor's offices, women began to take their place. Some wore pearls, others wore factory uniforms. A few wore black armbands in honor of sisters who never got the chance. Many of them ran on education, on clean water, on worker rights, on food safety, the things that touched a kitchen, a classroom, a hospital bed, the things that were not glamorous, but always mattered. And still they were told it was not enough. So they studied harder, wrote longer speeches, knocked on more doors, balanced ledgers by moonlight, held babies while reading zoning maps, and one by one voters began to notice. It was not a wave, not yet, but it was a ripple. In 1932, Hattie Caraway became the first woman elected to the Senate in her own right, not as a widow filling a husband's seat, but as herself. People laughed at first, said it was a fluke, but she kept winning, quiet, steady, relentless. The press called her Silent Hattie, but her votes were loud enough. Meanwhile, in other corners of the country, women were building networks. League of Women Voters, Women's Political Caucus. Campaign schools run out of living rooms with donated typewriters and borrowed phones. They mentored one another, shared talking points, practiced handshakes, raised money in bake sales and bridge games. They knew that politics was still a man's world, but they also knew that no world stays the same forever. Some of the women who ran lost. A lot, actually. Over and over. Their flyers rained down into gutters. Their speeches went unheard. But they kept trying, because for every campaign that failed, a new girl watched and learned that she could try. And when the Great Depression hit, it was often these women who held the fraying ends of community together, organizing soup kitchens, demanding fair wages, writing laws to protect children and the elderly. They were not always praised for it, but the people they helped remembered. And by the time Eleanor Roosevelt took the role of First Lady in 1933, the mold had cracked completely. She traveled, she spoke, she wrote, she listened, she held press conferences for female reporters when others would not. She went to coal mines, schools, prison yards, veterans' hospitals. She was not elected, but she redefined what it meant to be near power. Not everyone liked it, but change rarely waits for permission. In the background, more women kept filing papers to run, even if they knew they would lose, even if the local papers mocked them, even if the men in their party rolled their eyes. Because winning was not just about votes, it was about being seen. It was about making space in the imagination. It was about teaching the country what a leader could look like. And so the women kept running. Some wore lipstick, some wore calluses, some stumbled through debates, others lit up rooms. Most were somewhere in between. But every one of them added a new line to the story, and slowly the halls of power began to echo with different footsteps. As you drift off tonight, maybe picture one of those women, walking alone toward a microphone, heart pounding, hands shaking, maybe wondering if she is good enough, smart enough, tough enough, if people will laugh, if anyone will vote, if her children will be proud, and then stepping up anyway. Because history is not made by the ones who wait for certainty. It is made by the ones who run. War and work. You remember the posters, do you not? The one with the woman in the red bandana rolling up her sleeve saying, "We can do it." It is on coffee mugs now, refrigerator magnets, t-shirts. But back then, it was not a slogan. It was a call. Because when the world went to war, it did not wait for permission either. In 1941, after Pearl Harbor, everything shifted. Young men were drafted, factories roared to life. Ships had to be built, planes had to be made, and suddenly the same country that told women to stay home asked them to come in. They came in droves, over 6 million of them, welders, riveters, mechanics, inspectors, line operators. They wore slacks and bandanas, steel-toed boots and smudged goggles. They worked night shifts and day shifts, packed lunches in metal tins and drank coffee from tinier cups. They ran machines the size of trucks, read blueprints, counted bolts. Some learned to fly. And when the sirens sounded, they stayed put. In the factories, women carried wrenches in one hand and worries in the other. Worries about sons overseas, husbands missing, ration stamps and rent. They watched over neighbors' children while rotating shifts. They waited for letters that might never come. They learned how to hold grief quietly, in between conveyor belts and grease. And for many, it was the first time they earned their own paycheck. Do you remember what that meant? Not just the money, but the name printed on the stub. The agency, the independence, the feeling of walking to a counter, handing over bills you had earned with your own hands, and knowing just for a moment that you had power. It was not just in factories either. Women served in uniform too. In the Army Nurse Corps, the Waves, the Wasps, the Spars. They patched wounds in field tents, drove ambulances through rubble, piloted planes from base to base, typed orders, sorted intelligence, delivered messages that decided lives. Most were never given full military status. They wore the uniform, but not the benefits. Still, they showed up, and they stayed until the job was done. Back home, women ran farms, delivered mail, balanced books, invented workarounds when supplies dried up. They recycled rubber-collected scrap, grew vegetables in backyards and city lots. They ran entire towns while being told they could not run for office. And then peace. The war ended in 1945. The troops came home. So did the medals, the parades, the headlines. And then the country asked the women to go home too. Some did, some wanted to, others had no choice. The jobs were filled by returning soldiers. The posters came down, the factories slowed, the paychecks stopped. But something stayed. A memory, a taste, a knowledge that they had done it, that they had stepped into roles the world said they could not handle, and they had handled them, with courage, with competence, with quiet everyday grit. Some women never stopped working after that. Others did, but passed the story down. Maybe you heard it from your mother, or your aunt, or that quiet neighbor lady who always knew how to fix a leaky pipe. Maybe she said over pie and coffee, "I built wings for bombers," and you blinked because you had never imagined it. That was how the story traveled, not through monuments or textbooks, but through voices, through hands that taught recipes and also remembered rivets. Of course, the story did not end there. The 1950s came, a time of white picket fences, casseroles, and glossy magazines selling the ideal housewife. Women were told again that their place was behind a stove, not behind a desk, in pearls, not in politics, quiet, not questioning, and some believed it. But others remembered the factory floors, the roar of machines, the calluses on their palms, the rows of women laughing in lunchrooms trading stories and cigarettes. They remembered what it felt like to matter, and that memory would not go away. It lingered in the margins, in mothers who taught daughters how to change tires, in women who saved up for their own cars, in secretarial schools where the typing was fast and the minds behind the keys faster. It was a seed, waiting. And when the next storm came, the marches, the protests, the signs and slogans, it bloomed. But before we get to that part, let us take a moment. Picture one of those women from 1943. Grease on her sleeves, a photo of her fiancé in her shirt pocket, singing along to the radio while tightening bolts. She does not think she is changing history. She just thinks she is doing her part. And that perhaps is the most powerful thing of all. The second wave. There was a time not long after the war when it all seemed settled again. The lawns were trimmed, the sidewalks swept, the milk bottles left at the door right on time. Television sets glowed in living rooms, humming soft black and white promises. And women, Many of them were told they had come home, to their rightful place, to comfort, to quiet. But under all that quiet, something was stirring. It began as a kind of restlessness, a question that would not go away. Women who had riveted wings on bombers were now sewing hems in silence. Women who had once drawn maps for the army were drawing grocery lists instead. They loved their families. Of course they did. But in the pause between laundry loads and bedtime stories, some of them wondered, was that it? One of them was a young journalist named Betty Friedan. Maybe you read her book, The Feminine Mystique, or maybe you just remember the way it landed, like a stone in still water, like someone finally saying out loud what thousands of women had only whispered. She called it the problem that has no name. Because how do you name the ache that settles in your chest when everyone says you should be happy? That was the early 1960s. The world was already on the edge of change. Civil rights protests, Vietnam, the music, the marches. And into that swell of upheaval came women again, this time, not in overalls and goggles, but in college classrooms, courtrooms, and on the covers of magazines. They were asking for something radical, equality, not just the right to vote. That had been won, but the right to work and be paid fairly, to go to school and not be dismissed, to make choices about their own bodies, their own minds, their own futures. And this time, they were louder. Do you remember those headlines? The sit-ins, the picket signs, the hearings, Gloria Steinem in aviator glasses, Shirley Chisholm at the podium, Pauli Murray behind the scenes writing the words that would shape arguments for years to come. It was messy, it was not always polite, and it made a lot of people uncomfortable. But change often does. There were court cases, Griswold vs. Connecticut, Roe v. Wade. There were protests outside factories, universities, and Congress. There were women who chained themselves to doors, burned symbolic girdles, and held hands in defiance of a world that tried to erase them. Not all women agreed with the movement, of course. Some felt left out. Others felt it was moving too fast, or not fast enough. That was part of the story, too. Because women are not one story. They are millions. Black women, Native women, immigrant women, poor women, rich women, queer women, disabled women, women who wanted to climb corporate ladders, women who wanted to stay home and raise children and be respected for it, all of them trying in their own way to be heard, and some of them just trying to survive. There is one name I want you to remember: Dolores Huerta. Maybe you saw her once, standing beside Cesar Chavez organizing farm workers. But she was a mother of 11, co-founder of a labor union, and a voice so sharp and steady it cut through fields of injustice. And another name, Wilma Mankiller, the first female chief of the Cherokee Nation. Her leadership was not loud, but it was deep, rooted in history, in healing. These were not women on billboards, but their footprints are everywhere. The second wave of feminism, as people later called it, stretched through the 60s and 70s, and like the tide, it moved in pulses. Some victories were swift. The Equal Pay Act of 1963, Title IX in 1972. Others came more slowly. Some are still coming. And while laws changed, culture took longer. Some doors opened, others creaked. Some stayed shut. In boardrooms and bedrooms, in clinics and classrooms, in politics and at kitchen tables. Still, the voices rose. Maybe you remember those conversations, over dinner, or in church, or on the radio. Maybe you heard a cousin say, "I'm going back to school," or a niece declare, "I won't take his last name," or your daughter say, "I want something more." Maybe you smiled, maybe you worried, maybe both. But by then it was clear the whisper had become a wave, and it would not be turned back. And yet the movement also fractured. There were debates about race, about class, about inclusion, about what liberation really meant and for whom. It was not perfect, but it was alive, and it left echoes. In job applications where marital status was no longer required, in credit cards issued in a woman's name, in college brochures that no longer read for men only, and in the quiet ways too, in daughters who saw their mothers vote, in granddaughters who learned to speak up, in women who passed down not just recipes but stories of protest, of persistence. It was a second wave, yes, but it was also a second wind, because the fight was not over, not even close, but it had changed, and so had the women. Some of them were tired, some were just getting started, most were both, but now they knew what the first generation of suffragists had known. That change does not come as a gift. It comes as a demand and a promise, and sometimes as a whisper that refuses to stay quiet. Tomorrow we will follow that whisper into the halls of Congress, into Supreme Court chambers, into movements still unfolding. But for now, let us pause and remember that moment, maybe in 1971, maybe later when a woman walked into a workplace, sat at a desk with her name on it, and thought, I earned this. Not because someone allowed it, but because she claimed it, and the world at last had to make room. The hard fights of the 80s and 90s. By the time the 80s arrived, the wave had broken, but not faded. It was still moving, just deeper now, under the surface, and sometimes in ways harder to see. On the outside, it looked like progress had come. Women were on television, in boardrooms, on ballots. The Equal Rights Amendment was still being debated, but the tone had shifted. There were more women in college than ever before, more in law school, medical school, business school. But for all the suits and slogans, the fight had only grown more complicated. The world was changing. Fast. You might remember the shoulder pads, the power ties, the working woman image, glossy, unstoppable. There was even a movie or two about her. Working girl, baby boom. Women were supposed to have it all. A career, a family, a clean house, a clean conscience. But having it all often meant doing it all, and that was exhausting. Underneath the polished images were real lives, real women, balancing meetings and diapers, commuter trains and PTA nights, trying to rise without letting anything fall, and still being told, quietly or not, that they had something to prove. It was not just about ambition anymore. It was about proving they belonged. And all the while, the political winds were shifting. In 1980, Ronald Reagan was elected president, and with him came a conservative wave that pushed back against many of the gains made by the feminist movement. Family values, traditional roles, a focus on the home. The courts began to lean right. The Equal Rights Amendment, after a long and bitter battle, failed to be ratified by enough states. That was a blow, but not a silence. Women kept marching, kept organizing, kept running for office. And in 1981, something happened that changed everything for many women watching their TVs that summer. Sandra Day O'Connor was confirmed to the United States Supreme Court, the first woman ever. You might remember that smile she had, calm, controlled, but with something underneath it, a steel spine maybe, or just the weight of knowing history was on her shoulders. She was not the most radical figure, but she was a symbol, proof that doors could open, even the heavy marble ones in Washington. Still outside the courtrooms, the battles raged on. Reproductive rights were under siege again. Clinics were bombed. Doctors were threatened. New restrictions were introduced across states. And the debate about choice life autonomy grew louder, angrier, more painful. Some of the loudest voices were not men. They were women, on both sides. Because feminism was no longer one shape. it was fragmented. Some called it the age of difference feminism, the idea that women did not have to be like men to be equal. Others pushed back, insisting equality meant exactly that sameness under the law, under opportunity. And for women of color, these debates often felt like echoes of an older silence, because their struggles were not new, and sometimes they were not heard. There was a word that began to appear more often in the 90s, intersectionality, coined by Kimberlé Crenshaw, a way of explaining how race, gender, class, and other identities overlap and compound. It gave name to something many had long felt, that being a woman did not mean one thing, and that some women faced more than one kind of barrier. Do you remember the Clarence Thomas hearings in 1991? That fall, millions watched as Anita Hill sat in a packed Senate chamber and spoke with measured calm about what she said had happened to her, about harassment, power, silence. Some believed her, others did not. But something shifted. Women saw her, saw the way she was questioned, dismissed, disbelieved, and many thought, if that is how they treat her, what chance do I have? In the months that followed, something happened. Women ran, for office, for school boards, for Senate seats. They called 1992 the Year of the Woman. That November 4, women were elected to the U.S. Senate, dozens more to the House. It was not a revolution, but it was a start. There were other fights too. The fight against domestic violence gained ground. The Violence Against Women Act was passed in 1994. Shelters expanded. Hotlines were funded. The idea that abuse was a private matter began to erode. In culture, voices rose in song and screen. Alanis, Lauryn Hill, Toni Morrison, Oprah, women who told their stories unapologetically, who cried and raged and laughed in public. And behind closed doors, the conversations shifted about what a woman could be, should be, was allowed to be. Not everyone agreed, but the silence was gone. Still, there were wounds. You might remember the term glass ceiling, the one you could not see but kept bumping into. Women were in the workplace, but not always at the top, not paid the same, not promoted the same, not protected the same. And then there was the second shift. The work after work, the unpaid labor of cleaning, caregiving, cooking, invisible but constant. For many women, it never stopped. For some, it defined their entire lives. And yet, through it all, they kept going. Not because they had to, but because they wanted to. Because they believed something better was possible. And slowly it was. There were classrooms where girls studied science and believed it belonged to them. There were offices where maternity leave became a policy, not a plea. There were households where fathers did the dishes, packed the lunches, read the bedtime stories. Not everywhere, not always, but more than before. And if you looked closely, you could see it. In the way a young girl raised her hand without hesitation. In the way a mother introduced herself at a meeting without apology. In the way a woman walked into a courtroom, a newsroom, a classroom, and claimed her space not as a guest, but as a rightful owner. It had taken so long to get there, and there was still farther to go. But now the map was clearer. The battles of the 80s and 90s were not always glorious. They were not always televised, but they mattered, because they laid the ground so that someday someone else could fly. And in the quiet moments, maybe while folding laundry or paying bills, some women would think not of anger or even pride, but of something quieter. Relief. That finally their daughters might not have to fight the same fights, and their sons might grow up different too, more aware, more whole, more free. The road still ahead. I think about my grandmother sometimes. The way she whispered they didn't always let us like. It was a secret handed down, something sacred, but fragile. A reminder that nothing permanent ever feels like a miracle until you remember what it took to get there. And yet even now, there are places in the world where women cannot vote, where their names are not on ballots or even on the deeds to their homes, where silence is still the law, where resistance still begins in whispers. And even here in the places where the vote was won, the fight continues. In boardrooms and hospitals, in paychecks and headlines, in the quiet math of who gets heard and who does not. Some say the movement is over, that everything's equal now. But most of us know better. We know that freedom once earned must still be protected, that equality once imagined must still be built every day again and again. But we also know this: the voices are louder now, no longer whispers behind closed doors. They are chants in streets, speeches in Congress, lullabies sung to daughters, and promises made to sons. And maybe that is the quiet miracle, that what once took centuries now takes courage, that what once took chains and marches now takes ballots and books, that a little girl sitting cross-legged on her grandmother's carpet might grow up never doubting that her voice matters. Because it does. It always did. So, as you settle in tonight under the hush of your own roof, let the weight of that history rest beside you. Let it warm your chest like a blanket. And if you listen closely in the stillness of your room, you might just hear them. The voices, not haunting, but humming, not angry, but awake, telling you what they always meant to say. We are here. We made it this far, and we are not done. Sleep well, my friend. Tomorrow always needs voices like yours.